Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something fascinating, how we learn the second language.
It's a huge topic.
Definitely. And if you've ever tried to pick up a new tongue, or maybe taught one, or even just wondered how it all works, it's complex.
Absolutely. People come at it from so many different backgrounds, different motivations, learning in all sorts of environments.
Right. So to try and make sense of it all, researchers have come up with quite a few different theories over the years.
Yeah, different ways of looking at it. Think of them like different lenses focusing on the same basic journey, going from one language to knowing another.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we've pulled together a real mix of ideas. We'll look at how theories about learning our first language got applied to second languages,
Mhm.
what cognitive psychology tells us, the role of our social world, how just using the language shapes learning.
And even this newer idea of viewing it all as a kind of complex, ever-changing system.
So the mission today is basically to sift through all
Through
this.
the noise a bit.
Yeah, exactly. And pull out the really key insights from these different perspectives. We want to give you a clearer picture, kind of a shortcut to understanding what's going on in second language acquisition.
Sounds good. Where should we start?
Okay, let's kick things off way back with the behaviorist perspective. What's the core idea there?
Well, at its heart, behaviorism basically said language learning happens through simple stuff.
Mhm.
Imitation, lots of practice, getting feedback,
Like
reinforces.
training a dog almost.
It's sort of, yeah. The comparison was often made to animal learning. Repeat something, get a reward, and that behavior becomes a habit. Habit formation was really the central concept.
Okay. And that idea, habit formation, how did that actually play out in language teaching? It sounds a bit like rote memorization.
It kind of was, yeah.
Yeah.
In the, say, 1940s up to the 70s, especially in North America, behaviorism was hugely influential. People like Nelson Brooks, Robert Lido, they were big proponents.
So what did classrooms look like?
Lots of drilling. Audiolingual methods were dominant. Think mimicry, repeating dialogues over and over, memorizing sentence patterns until they supposedly became automatic.
And this led to something called the contrastive analysis hypothesis, the idea that your first language messes things up.
Exactly. That was the logical extension. The thinking was the habits from your native language, your L1, would directly interfere with forming new habits in the second language, the L2.
So teachers would look for the differences between the two languages.
And focus drills on those specific points where interference was predicted. The tricky spots, basically.
But that didn't turn out to be the whole story, did it? Our understanding shifted.
Right. Research started showing that, well, learners were making all sorts of errors that you just couldn't predict by comparing the L1 and L2. Errors that didn't seem to come from L1 interference at all.
So people started moving away from it.
Pretty much, yeah. Both behaviorism as a complete explanation for language learning and the contrastive analysis hypothesis lost favor. Though, it's worth saying, some of those ideas about practice and habit formation do pop up again later, but within different theoretical frameworks.
Interesting. Okay, so if we moved away from habits, where do we go next? The innatist perspective sounds completely different. Chomsky. Or,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Chomsky's work on first language acquisition was a huge turning point. He argued pretty strongly against behaviorism, saying children couldn't possibly learn language just through imitation and reinforcement
Why not?
because they produce sentences they've never heard before, they understand complex rules. He argued we must be born with some kind of innate language faculty, a sort of blueprint for language. He called it universal grammar, or UG.
Like a built-in guide to how languages work.
Essentially, yes. A set of underlying principles common to all human languages that children are born with, which helps them figure out the specific rules of the language they're exposed to.
And how did that idea get applied to learning a second language? Does UG still work?
That's the big question linguists like Lydia White explored. The argument is, yes, UG likely still plays a role in L2 acquisition. It constrains the possibilities, guiding learners away from wildly ungrammatical structures they might otherwise try. It gives them a head start, in a way.
There's also this idea of the logical problem of language acquisition. What's that about?
Vivian Cook talked about this. The problem is basically that learners, both L1 and L2, seem to end up knowing more subtle rules and principles about the language than they could have possibly figured out just from the input they hear.
So they know things they weren't explicitly taught or even exposed to.
Exactly. Which suggests there must be some kind of innate knowledge guiding them, filling in the gaps. It points back to something like universal grammar being involved.
But is that UG fully available for second language learners? Is there a debate?
Oh, definitely. That's a major point of discussion. Some argue UG is fully accessible, just like for kids learning their first language. Others, including White herself, suggest that acquiring the first language might change how UG operates for later languages.
How so?
Well, maybe your L1 settings overwrite some of the initial UG options, potentially leading you to make assumptions about the L2 that aren't correct, and you might need explicit teaching to reset those.
It sounds like this whole innatist perspective really zooms in on the underlying grammatical knowledge, maybe more than just everyday speaking ability.
That's generally true, especially for UG-focused research.
Hmm.
It often looks at the competence of more advanced learners, trying to understand their intuitions about complex grammar, often using things like grammaticality judgment tasks.
Assessing what they know about the language, not just what they say.
Precisely, trying to get at that underlying system.
Now, probably the most famous model linked to this way of thinking is Krashen's monitor model. It had a huge impact, didn't it?
It really did, especially on teaching practices for a while. Krashen proposed 5 main hypotheses.
Okay, let's break those down. First one.
The acquisition learning hypothesis. He made a strong distinction between subconsciously acquiring language, like kids do, just by understanding messages.
And consciously learning it, like studying grammar rules in school.
Exactly. And he argued that acquisition, that subconscious process, was far more important for actually being able to use the language fluently. That focus on meaningful input was really influential.
Okay, makes sense. What's next?
The monitor hypothesis. This suggested that the rules we consciously learn act as a sort of monitor or editor.
Ah, like an internal proofreader.
Kind of, yeah. We can use it to check and correct what we're about to say or write, but, and this is key, only if we have enough time, if we're focused on being correct, and if we actually know the rule we need.
So not very useful in spontaneous conversation, maybe.
Often not, according to the model. Then there's the natural order hypothesis,
Says
that we acquire grammatical structures in a predictable order. And this order isn't necessarily based on how simple the rule seems or when it's taught in class. Some things just get acquired earlier than others, universally.
regardless of teaching order. Interesting. And the comprehensible input hypothesis. That sounds central.
It really is, often seen as the cornerstone. The idea is that we acquire language when we understand input that's just slightly beyond our current level. He called it I+1.
Input you can mostly understand, but with a little bit of new stuff.
Exactly. That I+1 is what pushes your development forward, not input that's too complex or input that contains nothing new.
And the last one, the affective filter.
This one deals with emotions and attitudes. Krashen proposed an affective filter, things like anxiety, low motivation, poor self-confidence that can act like a barrier.
So even if the input is comprehensible, the filter can block it from actually being acquired.
That was the idea. If the filter is up, acquisition is hindered. If it's down, the input gets through.
Krashen's model was, as you said, very influential, but it also faced some criticism.
It did. Significant criticism, actually. Researchers like McLaughlin and White pointed out that some of the key concepts, like the distinction between acquisition and learning, were very difficult, maybe impossible, to actually test empirically.
Hard to prove.
Right. And they questioned some of the conclusions drawn from the research Krashen cited. But despite the critiques, his emphasis on comprehensible input really resonated and pushed language teaching towards more communicative approaches, focusing on meaning rather than just grammar rules. That impact is undeniable.
And what about later research? Did it back up all aspects of the model?
Not entirely. While the importance of comprehensible input is still widely accepted, subsequent research has pretty clearly shown that instruction, both explicit teaching of rules and more implicit approaches, can make a difference.
So conscious learning isn't useless.
It seems not. Studies suggest instruction can speed up learning and help learners notice and use features they might otherwise miss or misuse, which contradicts Krashen's stronger claims about the very limited role of conscious learning.
Okay, so that takes us through behaviorism and innatism. Let's shift gears now to the cognitive perspective. How did psychology start influencing the field?
Well, starting around the 1990s, cognitive psychology became a much bigger player. It brought in ideas about how the mind processes information, generally perception, memory, attention, categorization.
Using metaphors like the mind as a computer.
Sometimes, yes. That information processing angle became prominent. And there was also a growing interest in connecting language learning to what we were learning about the brain through neuroscience.
And the basic idea here is that learning a second language isn't some unique, separate mental faculty.
Broadly speaking, yes. Cognitive approaches tend to assume that general learning mechanisms, the same ones we use for learning other complex skills, can also account for language acquisition, both first and second.
So no need for a special language module like UG proposed.
Not necessarily. The differences between L1 and L2 learning are often seen as arising from factors like the learner's age, their existing knowledge of an L1, and the specific learning circumstances, rather than fundamentally different cognitive processes.
Let's dig into one of these cognitive frameworks. Information processing. What's the gist?
Information processing models view L2 learning as essentially building up knowledge that becomes increasingly automatic. Initially, learners have to pay a lot of conscious attention to new words or grammar rules. It takes up mental effort.
Like learning to drive a car. You have to think about every little thing at first.
Exactly like that. But with practice, processing becomes more efficient, more automatic. You don't have to consciously think about verb endings or word order anymore. This frees up your attention to focus on the meaning, the flow of conversation.
So fluency comes from automating these lower-level processes.
That's a key idea. Fluent speakers rely heavily on predictable patterns and chunks of language formulaic sequences that they can retrieve automatically. It applies to understanding, too. Proficient listeners access word meanings almost instantly, which helps them keep up.
And this ties into the idea of L2 acquisition being a type of skill learning.
Yes, very much so. Researchers like Robert de Keyser, drawing on general skill acquisition theories like Anderson's, frame it this way. You start with declarative knowledge, knowing that a rule exists, maybe being able to state it.
Knowing about the language.
Right. Then, through practice, this transforms into procedural knowledge, knowing how to use the rule, actually applying it in speaking or writing, though maybe still slowly or awkwardly.
Being able to do it.
Exactly. And the final stage is automatization, where you can use that knowledge rapidly, accurately, and unconsciously without even thinking about the rule itself.
But learning isn't always this smooth, gradual automation, is it? Sometimes learners jump forward or even seem to slide back.
That's a crucial point, and it leads to the concept of restructuring. Sometimes, a learner's internal mental representation of the language seems to undergo a more fundamental reorganization.
Not just getting faster, but thinking about it differently.
Precisely. This can lead to sudden bursts of progress, but also sometimes to periods of apparent backsliding, where learners start making errors on things they previously seemed to have mastered. The classic example is overgeneralizing the regular past tense rule. A child who correctly used went might suddenly start saying goed after learning the ed ending.
Applying the new pattern too broadly.
Right. It shows the system is being reorganized, even if it causes temporary errors.
And what about transfer-appropriate processing? How does that fit in?
Transfer-appropriate processing, or TTAP, basically highlights that how well we retrieve or use information depends on how similar the situation is to when we learned it.
So practice should resemble how you actually want to use the language.
Ideally, yes. If you only learn vocabulary from lists, you might get good at list-based tests, but struggle to use those words in a conversation. Learning grammar rules explicitly might help you on a grammar quiz, but not necessarily influence speaking if you haven't practiced using those rules communicatively. The context matters.
Okay. Now, another perspective that really emphasizes learning from experience is usage-based learning. How's this different from, say, the innatist view?
It's quite different. Usage-based approaches put the emphasis squarely on the language input the learner receives. It argues that we learn language structures, including grammar, directly from our experience with language, not from innate linguistic blueprints like UG.
So it's all about exposure and patterns.
Pretty much. It downplays the role of conscious, declarative knowledge of rules and instead focuses on the frequency with which learners encounter specific linguistic features and how often they occur together.
Like hearing "he walks" thousands of times helps you learn the as ending.
Exactly. The idea is that through massive exposure, we build up strong associative connections in our minds between forms, meanings, and the context they appear in. It also suggests we learn language in chunks, larger than single words, phrases, idioms, sentence frames.
And this can explain errors too, like that good example.
Yes. Computer simulations based on usage-based principles show that these systems can learn patterns from input and then generalize them, sometimes overgeneralizing, just like humans do. It suggests pattern extraction from input is a powerful mechanism.
Okay, shifting slightly, what about the competition model? What's competing here?
The competition model, developed by Bates and McWhinney, is about how learners figure out which linguistic cues are reliable indicators of meaning in a particular language. These cues could be word order, grammatical markers like case endings or verb conjugations, or even the animacy of nouns, whether something is alive or not.
And different languages rely on different cues.
Absolutely. English, for instance, relies very heavily on subject-verb-object word order. The dog chased the cat means something completely different from the cat chased the dog.
Even if a cat chasing a dog is less likely.
Right. Word order often trumps other cues for English speakers. But in languages like, say, Russian or German with rich case markings, or Spanish or Italian with more flexible word order, other cues become much more important. Grammatical endings or subject-verb agreement might clearly signal who did what, regardless of the word order.
So an English speaker learning Italian might initially rely too much on word order.
Exactly. That's the challenge. They need to learn to suppress their L1 reliance on word order and pay more attention to the cues that are more important in Italian, like verb endings or perhaps pronoun forms. The competition is about learning the relative strength or reliability of these different cues in the new language.
Fascinating how the brain adapts. Speaking of which, what has neuroscience told us about where L2 learning happens in the brain?
It's a rapidly evolving field. Early ideas often suggested language was strongly lateralized to the left hemisphere. But more recent brain imaging studies, using things like fMRI, show a more complex picture.
Both hemispheres involved?
Yes, typically activity is seen in both hemispheres for both L1 and L2 processing, although the patterns can differ. There's also evidence that things like the age of acquisition and proficiency level matter.
How so?
Some studies suggest, for example, that learners who start later in life might show activation across a wider network of brain areas compared to early bilinguals, perhaps indicating they rely on more general cognitive resources.
And as learners get better, does their brain activity change?
There's evidence for that too. Research using EEG, which measures electrical activity, suggests that as L2 proficiency increases, the brain's responses to language input become more similar to those seen in native speakers. The processing becomes more efficient, more native-like.
That's amazing. But we should probably be wary of those ads promising learn Spanish in a week with our brain training app, right?
Oh, absolutely. While the neuroscience is fascinating and holds future promise, we're still a long way from translating these findings into simple, proven teaching methods. Be skeptical of overly simplistic, brain-based learning claims.
Good advice. Okay, we've covered a lot of the big theories. Now let's shift to how these ideas apply more directly to the process of learning, interacting, noticing, processing, practicing. Let's start with the interaction hypothesis.
Right. This perspective, associated with researchers like Evelyn Hatch, Michael Long, Teresa Pica, Susan Gass, really emphasizes the role of conversational interaction.
Talking to people is key.
Essentially, yes. The argument is that acquisition is driven not just by receiving input, but by actively participating in conversations, especially when you have to work to understand and make yourself understood.
The struggle helps you learn.
In a way.
Oh.
Long particularly focused on modified interaction. When communication breaks down, speakers adjust their language to help each other understand.
How? What kind of adjustments?
Things like comprehension checks, clarification requests, what was that? Or paraphrasing and repetition. This negotiation of meaning is thought to make input more comprehensible and draw attention to linguistic form. Long later also emphasized the role of noticing and receiving corrective feedback within these interactions.
And this connects to Swain's comprehensible output hypothesis.
It does, very nicely. Merrill Swain argued that just understanding input isn't enough. Learners also need to be pushed to produce language that is comprehensible, coherent, and accurate.
Why is producing language so important?
Because the act of trying to express a precise meaning can make learners realize the limits of their current knowledge. How do I say that? It forces them to notice gaps and try out new forms or structures, essentially pushing their development forward.
Okay, so interaction and output are crucial. What about the noticing hypothesis?
This comes largely from Richard Schmidt. His core idea was quite simple but profound. You don't learn what you don't notice.
Just being exposed isn't enough.
According to Schmidt, no. He argued that learners need to consciously notice a particular language feature in the input, pay attention to it, for it to become intake. That is, data that can actually be processed for learning.
He had a personal story related to this, didn't he?
Yes, while learning Portuguese in Brazil. He kept detailed diaries and realized he only started mastering certain grammatical forms after he'd consciously noticed them being used around him, even though he'd been hearing them for months.
So noticing is the gateway to learning.
That's the claim. Susan Gass elaborated, suggesting noticing might involve perceiving a gap between what you know and what you're hearing, or noticing something that differs from your expectations based on your L1 or current L2 knowledge.
Is there debate about whether this noticing has to be fully conscious?
Yes, that's debated. How much awareness is required? Can subconscious noticing occur? Researchers use various methods to try and track attention, asking learners to think aloud, tracking eye movements to see what they look at while reading. It's an active area of research.
All right, next up, input processing. This sounds like it's about how we handle the language coming in.
Exactly. Bill Van Patten is the key name here. He observed that because learners, especially beginners, have limited mental processing capacity, they tend to prioritize getting the meaning, the main message, over paying close attention to grammatical details or forms.
Meaning first, grammar second.
Often, yes. His famous example involves English speakers learning Spanish misinterpreting sentences like "La sigue el señor," the man follows her, as she follows the man, because they rely on the English SVO word order and might miss the clue provided by the object pronoun la.
So they miss crucial grammatical information because they're focused on basic word order meaning?
Precisely. Van Patten argued that learners need instruction that actively pushes them to notice and process these grammatical forms in the input, because just understanding the gist isn't enough to acquire the grammar accurately.
Okay, that leads nicely into processability theory. This looks at the order of acquisition, right?
Yes, based initially on studies of German L2 acquisition by migrant workers. Researchers like Meisel, Clausen, and Peinemann found that learners acquired certain syntactic and morphological features in remarkably consistent developmental sequences.
An order everyone follows.
Broadly, yes, although the rate of progression varies hugely. This sequence seemed related to the processing demands of the structures. Simpler things, like adding an ending to a word, might be acquired before more complex things involving moving elements around in a sentence.
So it's about cognitive readiness to handle certain structures.
That's the core idea Peinemann developed into processability theory. It suggests that learners can only acquire structures that their current cognitive processing capacity allows them to handle. It also tries to explain why L1 transfer doesn't happen wholesale right from the start. You can only transfer L1 features if your L2 processing ability is ready to accommodate them.
And this led to the teachability hypothesis.
Correct. Which basically says instruction is most beneficial when it targets structures that the learner is developmentally ready for the next step in their natural processing sequence, essentially. Teaching things that are too complex too early might not be effective.
Okay, we've talked about input, noticing, processing.
Yeah.
What about good old-fashioned practice? Is it back in favor?
Definitely, but with a twist.
Yeah.
Within the cognitive perspective, there's a renewed appreciation for practice, but it's understood differently from the old behaviorist drills.
Not just mindless repetition.
No. The emphasis now is on practice that is meaningful, that connects language forms with their intended meanings, and that helps automate language use. It's seen as crucial for converting that declarative knowledge, knowing about, into procedural knowledge, knowing how, and then into automatized knowledge.
And this applies across the board. Reading, writing, speaking, listening.
Yes. Practice is seen as essential for building fluency and accuracy in all skills. Researchers like Lourdes Ortega suggest effective practice should be interactive, meaningful, and focused on task-essential forms. Models like Access, developed by Gap-Bonton and Segalovitz, emphasize repeated, meaningful use of specific language chunks in real communication to build that automaticity.
So practice frees up your brain to think about higher-level stuff.
Exactly. By making basic language processing automatic, you free up cognitive resources to focus on complex meanings, social nuances, strategic communication, and so on.
Okay, let's shift perspectives again to the sociocultural view. This really brings the social context front and center, doesn't it? Vygotsky.
Absolutely. Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, SCT, argues that higher cognitive functions, including language, originate in social interaction. Learning isn't just an individual mental process, it's fundamentally social.
Speaking and thinking are linked.
Deeply intertwined, according to Vygotsky. We learn by doing things together with others, and language is the primary tool we use for this. We internalize knowledge and ways of thinking through dialogue and collaboration, especially within the zone of proximal development, or ZPD.
The ZPD, that's what a learner can do with help, right?
Yes, the gap between what they can do alone and what they can achieve with guidance or collaboration from a more knowledgeable person, a teacher, a peer, even a parent. This guidance is often called scaffolding.
How does the ZPD compare to Krashen's I+1? Both seem to involve learning at the edge of one's ability.
They sound similar, But SET researchers like Dunn and Landhoff argue they're quite different conceptually. Questions I+1 is about comprehensible input received by the individual learner. The ZPD is about collaborative activity and co-constructed knowledge. Learning happens through the interaction in the ZPD. It's not just triggered by input.
And how does SET differ from the interaction hypothesis we discussed earlier? Both stress interaction.
Again, a subtle but important difference. The interaction hypothesis often sees interaction mainly as a way to make input comprehensible or get feedback, which then fuels internal cognitive processes. SET sees the social interaction itself as constituting the learning process. The thinking and learning happen between people before they get internalized.
So for L2 learning, SET means learning happens by talking, through collaboration.
Precisely. Researchers like Landhoff and Donato have applied SET to L2 learning, showing how learners acquire language as they participate in collaborative tasks and dialogues. This isn't limited to expert-novice interaction. The ZPD can also be created between peers, as Swain and Lafkin showed.
And this links back to Swain's output hypothesis, too.
Yes, because in collaborative dialogue, learners often need to refine their utterances to make their meaning clear to their partner, pushing them to use language more accurately and complexly. For SET, this dialogue isn't just practice, it's where learning and cognitive development actually occur.
Okay, one final major perspective, complex dynamic systems theory. This sounds big, and maybe a bit abstract.
It is quite broad, yes. CDST draws concepts from complexity science and dynamic systems theory, often found in physics, biology, or mathematics. It views language, learning, and the context they occur in as complex dynamic systems.
Meaning lots of interconnected parts, constantly changing.
Exactly. Like an ecosystem, or the weather, or brain activity. These systems have many components that interact in nonlinear ways, meaning small changes can sometimes have big, unpredictable effects. And they're dynamic, constantly in flux, never static.
So language learning isn't a neat step-by-step process from this view.
Definitely not. CDST emphasizes the interconnectedness of everything: linguistic knowledge, cognitive processes, motivation, social factors, cultural context. A change in one area can ripple through the system. It also highlights the nonlinearity of development. Learners don't follow identical paths. There's lots of variability, plateaus, sudden jumps, even apparent regressions.
And this variability is important.
Very. CDST sees variability not as noise, but as potential information about the learning process itself. And it stresses the dynamic nature learning is constant change, driven by interaction with the environment and the system's tendency to self-organize. That restructuring we talked about earlier, CDST sees that as an example of self-organization.
Does CDST connect with other theories, like usage-based ideas about frequency?
It does. It acknowledges that frequency of exposure and the strengthening of connections between forms, meanings, and contexts are crucial, aligning with usage-based ideas. But it embeds these within a much larger interconnected system.
It sounds incredibly difficult to research, though. How do you study a system that complex and fluid?
That's the major challenge. Traditional research methods, looking for simple cause and effect, often don't capture the dynamics well. Researchers are developing new methodologies, analyzing development over time in individual learners, using computational modeling, looking for patterns in variability.
Are there practical applications emerging from CDST?
We're starting to see some. For instance, studies looking at how learner motivation isn't stable but fluctuates dynamically depending on the task or classroom environment. Or research tracking moment-to-moment changes in willingness to communicate.
Anything related to teaching methods?
There's the dynamic usage-based or DUB approach, which combines CDST and usage-based principles. One example is the movie approach, using repeated exposure to rich, authentic, comprehensible input, like watching subtitled films.
And does it work?
Some studies, like one comparing it to a traditional task-based approach in Vietnam, found the movie group showed greater progress on various measures. The researchers interpreted this as supporting CDST. The benefits arise from the complex dynamics of processing meaningful input over time.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground, from behaviorist habits to dynamic systems. What's the big takeaway from all these different theories?
Well, the first thing is that they're all trying to explain this incredibly complex human capacity. And it's important to remember, they often use metaphors: the mind as a computer, language as an instinct, learning as building connections, learning as social participation, language as an ecosystem, to talk about processes we can't directly see.
And they rely on different kinds of evidence to back up their claims.
Exactly. Innatists might look at the intricate structure of language itself and learner intuitions. Cognitivists often use controlled experiments or computer simulations. Interactionists analyze conversations. Usage-based researchers look at massive databases of real language use. Socioculturalists observe learning in social contexts.
Hmm.
And CDST tries to integrate insights across multiple levels.
It sounds like there's still no single theory that everyone agrees on.
That's definitely true. There are ongoing debates, critiques between perspectives. Linguists might criticize the artificiality of some psych lab experiments, for instance. But the field is evolving. Technology is allowing more research in natural settings.
Are there any common threads emerging?
I think so. There's a growing consensus across many perspectives, cognitive, usage-based, even interactionist, about the importance of repeated, meaningful exposure and use for developing fluency and automaticity. There's also strong evidence from interactionist and sociocultural views about the power of social support and collaboration.
But still fundamental disagreements, too.
Oh, yes. About the role of innate knowledge versus learning purely from experience, for example, or the relative importance of internal cognitive processes versus social interaction as the primary driver of learning.
It must be frustrating sometimes for teachers or learners just wanting to know what's the best way.
It can be. There isn't one simple answer derived from a single unified theory. But that doesn't mean the theories aren't useful. Developing these explanations helps us understand the process better, even if they're incomplete. And interestingly, you see similar concepts popping up in different theories, maybe framed differently, like practice in behaviorism and cognitive usage-based views, or restructuring in cognitive theory and nonlinearity in CDST.
So researchers are trying to build bridges.
Yes, there are efforts, like the Douglas Fir Group, aiming for more transdisciplinary frameworks. But in the meantime, teachers still need to teach, and learners still need to learn. There's a growing body of applied research drawing insights from various theories to inform pedagogical practices.
So even without that single magic bullet theory, exploring all these different angles gives us a much richer appreciation for what's involved in learning a second language.
Absolutely. It highlights just how multifaceted it is: cognitive, social, linguistic, affective, all interacting in complex ways. Hopefully, reflecting on these different explanations helps you, the listener, appreciate that complexity.
Definitely. It leaves us with a lot to think about. So maybe a final thought for you listening. Considering all these perspectives we've touched on today, behaviorism, innatist, cognitive science, interaction, sociocultural views, dynamic systems, what aspect of second language learning do you find the most compelling, or perhaps still the most mysterious? There's certainly plenty more to explore. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.